The Panther's engine idles in neutral, a low vibration that travels through the steel floor and into the bones of the loader crouched beside the breech. Diesel fumes hang in the fighting compartment. Outside, through the commander's periscope, the intersection sits empty. Rubble-choked streets feeding into a square where nothing moves. Cologne Cathedral rises a few hundred meters to the northeast, its twin spires somehow still standing above the wreckage of everything else. The date is March 6, 1945. This crew has been here since dawn. The position is textbook. The Panther sits backed into the shadow of a ruined building, its glacis plate angled toward the western approach where the Americans will come. They always come from the west. The 75-millimeter gun, the long-barreled KWK-42, points at the intersection like a finger. Range to the far corner, maybe 80 meters, point blank. The gunner doesn't need his optics at this distance. He could shoot by sound alone. They have done this before. In the Ardennes and at Aachen, in every collapsing pocket since Normandy, the American Shermans come around corners and the Shermans die. The mathematics are brutal and simple. The Panther's gun penetrates 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The Sherman's frontal plate is 51 millimeters thick, sloped. The Sherman's 75-millimeter gun, even the high-velocity version, struggles to penetrate the Panther's front at any range. In a frontal engagement, the American has to close to 400 meters and aim for the turret mantelet's weak spots. The Panther can kill at ranges the Sherman cannot even threaten. This is why the crew waits with something like calm. The commander's name was almost certainly Bartelborth. Records conflict on rank. What's clear is that he'd survived long enough to understand his machine's advantages, and long enough to internalize the belief that American armor existed to be destroyed. Months of evidence supported this. The Shermans burned. The Shermans brewed up in columns of orange flame that rose above the hedgerows, the villages, the frozen forests. The crews called them Tommykokers, Tommy Cookers. One crewman's letter home, captured later, translated by Army intelligence, put it simply, "Against the Panther, they have nothing." The loader shifts his weight. The ready rack holds 17 rounds of Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing ammunition. The gunner's hand rests near the elevation wheel. The driver watches the fuel gauge. The radio operator monitors a frequency that has been mostly static for hours. 5 men in a steel box waiting for the intersection to fill with targets. Then it does. Something appears at the corner. The silhouette is wrong. The hull is longer than a Sherman, lower. The turret sits differently, more massive, more deliberately shaped. The gun barrel extending from that turret is visibly larger than anything the Americans have fielded in this theater. The suspension carries more weight. The whole machine moves with a different center of gravity, heavier, more deliberate. This is not a Sherman. The Panther crew had trained against Shermans, fought Shermans, killed Shermans. They knew the Sherman's proportions, the way a hunter knows the silhouette of familiar prey. What rounds the corner at the intersection in Cologne on March 6, 1945, belongs to no category they recognize. How did a tank the Germans had never encountered before, a tank rushed to Europe in numbers so small it barely existed, end up in exactly the right intersection, at exactly the right moment to break 20 months of Panther dominance? That's what this story is actually about. Not just what happened in Cologne, but the industrial and tactical chain that put a weapon into combat before the enemy even knew it existed. I'm still piecing together the production records and the unit histories for this one. If you want to see where it goes, subscribe now. Like the video so it finds the people who care about armor warfare. And if you've got a source I haven't found, a letter, a report, a family story from someone who was there, comments are open. The tank coming around the corner weighed 46 tons. It carried a 90-millimeter gun derived from an anti-aircraft weapon. It had been in Europe for exactly 49 days. Fewer than 200 existed anywhere in the world, and most of those were still in transit or in depots. The odds of this specific Panther crew encountering this specific machine on this specific street corner were vanishingly small. But the Pershing didn't need odds. It needed one shot. And the crew inside the Panther, processing the silhouette, adjusting their assumptions, trying to categorize what they saw, had already lost the fraction of a second that would determine whether they lived or died. January 1943, 14 months before D-Day, 26 months before Cologne. In an office at Army Ground Forces headquarters in Washington, the question of what American tanks should carry into Europe had already been answered, and the answer was wrong. The man most responsible for that answer was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, brilliant organizer, ruthless standardizer, the architect of the 90-division gamble that would stretch American manpower across 2 oceans. McNair believed in doctrine, the way some men believe in scripture, and his doctrine said this: tanks do not fight tanks. Tanks exploit breakthroughs, pursue retreating infantry, support riflemen clearing villages. When enemy armor appears, you call the tank destroyers, specialized vehicles with big guns and light armor, designed to kill panzers from ambush positions. The medium tank's job is mobility and infantry support. The medium tank does not need a gun that can duel a Panther at 1,000 meters, because the medium tank should never be dueling a Panther at 1,000 meters. The tank destroyers would handle that. McNair's Army Ground Forces controlled procurement priorities, training doctrine, equipment specifications. What McNair believed became what the Army bought, and McNair believed the Sherman was enough. Reports came back from North Africa. American tankers had encountered the Tiger for the first time at Kasserine Pass, and the Tiger had killed Shermans at ranges where the Shermans couldn't reply. The Ordnance Department proposed mounting a 90-millimeter gun, the same weapon already in production for anti-aircraft use, on an enlarged Sherman chassis. A GF rejected the proposal. The reasoning, preserved in memoranda that survive in the National Archives, was that a heavier tank would strain logistics, complicate spare parts supply, and solve a problem that proper tactical employment would prevent. The Tiger was rare. The Panther didn't exist yet. The Sherman worked. Why build something bigger when you could build more of what already worked? This was not stupidity. This was institutional logic applied with the subtlety of a stamping press. McNair's Army Ground Forces faced real constraints: shipping tonnage, training pipelines, maintenance capacity, the brutal arithmetic of getting millions of men and their equipment across an ocean. Every pound added to a tank meant less of something else on the convoy. Every new vehicle type meant new parts chains, new manuals, new depot procedures, new specializations. The Sherman already existed in thousands. American factories understood it. American mechanics could fix it. American ports could load it. The system favored what the system already knew. And so the reports kept coming. Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and AGF kept finding reasons why the next theater would be different, why the tactical situation that exposed Sherman weaknesses was an aberration rather than a pattern. Ordnance kept proposing. A GF kept rejecting. The T-26, the prototype that would become the Pershing, existed on paper as early as 1943. It sat in bureaucratic limbo while American tankers learned to count the seconds between seeing a Panther and dying. The file on this period includes a phrase that appears in multiple memoranda: battle need not established. A GF's position was that no combat commander had formally requested a heavy tank with sufficient urgency to override the logistical objections. This was technically accurate in the way that bureaucracies are often technically accurate. The request forms weren't filed, the proper channels weren't used, the dead couldn't submit paperwork. Meanwhile, ordnance officers who had visited the front came back with accounts that didn't fit the doctrine. One report noted that American tankers in Italy had taken to welding extra armor plate, scavenged from destroyed vehicles, onto their Shermans, field modifications that added weight and strained transmissions while accomplishing almost nothing against German guns. The crews knew. The men inside the steel boxes understood the mathematics McNair's headquarters preferred not to calculate. But the men inside the steel boxes did not control procurement. McNair himself was killed by American bombs during Operation Cobra in July 1944. Friendly fire during the carpet bombing that broke the Normandy stalemate. By then, American armor had been fighting Panthers for 6 weeks. The loss ratios were becoming impossible to ignore. Eisenhower's headquarters began demanding something that could meet German armor on equal terms. The bureaucratic ice started cracking. But cracking isn't breaking, and the Army ground forces mindset didn't die with McNair. His replacement, General Ben Lear, inherited the same institutional assumptions. The Pershing program accelerated, but acceleration in military procurement meant months, not weeks. The tank that would round the corner in Cologne had to survive committee meetings, production retooling, shipping priorities, and the fundamental belief embedded in Army doctrine like rebar in concrete that American tanks existed to support infantry while someone else handled the panzers. Every Pershing that reached Europe arrived over the institutional corpse of an idea that had killed American tankers for 2 years. The shipping manifest for convoy UGS-73 lists the cargo by weight class and priority code. Buried among the artillery pieces, the replacement engines, the thousands of tons of ammunition crossing from New York to Antwerp in late January 1945, a line item appears: 20 M26 heavy tanks, total weight 920 tons, destination 1st Army Depot, 20 tanks for all of Europe. The first Pershings touched European soil on February 15, 1945, 19 days before the Cologne engagement. The Grand Alliance had been fighting Germany for 5.5 years. The United States had been in the war for 38 months. American tankers had been dying in Shermans against Panthers for 9 months straight, from the hedgerows of Normandy through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And the weapon that could change that equation arrived with less than 3 weeks to spare. The logistics chain that delivered those 20 tanks reads like a parody of bureaucratic compression. Production at the Detroit Tank Arsenal had begun in November 1944. Not mass production, but the careful assembly of what ordnance called a limited procurement run. Each M26 required components that didn't exist in the Sherman supply chain. The Ford GAF engine, heavier than the Sherman's power plant. The 90-millimeter gun with its modified anti-aircraft breech. The new HVSS suspension to carry the extra weight. Transmission assemblies designed for 46 tons instead of 33. The factories that built Shermans by the thousand had to retool stations, train workers, establish new quality control procedures. November bled into December, then January. The tanks trickled out of Detroit at a rate that would have embarrassed a cottage industry. Then came the crossing. Shipping space to Europe in early '45 wasn't allocated by urgency alone. It was allocated by weight and convoy schedule, by the grinding mathematics of what could physically fit on which ship, leaving which port on which date. The Pershings drew 46 tons each. That meant heavy lift capacity and specialized loading equipment. Priority that had to be stolen from something else. 20 tanks represented a shipping burden equivalent to 60 Shermans. 60 Shermans that wouldn't arrive. 60 experienced crews that would wait for vehicles. The logisticians made the trade grudgingly, and they made it late. By the time those first 20 M26s reached Antwerp, they had to be prepared for combat, a process that added more days. The vehicles arrived in shipping configuration, guns packed in Cosmoline, optical equipment crated separately, tracks sometimes removed for transport. Ordnance depots had never handled the type before. Mechanics worked from preliminary manuals, solving problems the manual authors hadn't anticipated. Electrical systems needed adjustment for European voltage standards. Radios required retuning. The tanks had to be test-fired, and the ranges near Antwerp were backed up with vehicles from a dozen other units, all demanding priority. The crews presented their own problem. The men assigned to the first Pershings had trained on Shermans. The M26 handled differently, heavier on the controls, slower to accelerate, harder on the driver. The gunner's station used unfamiliar optics, different traverse mechanisms, new ammunition handling procedures. Tankers who had survived months of combat in Shermans now had to learn a new machine in days. Some adapted faster than others. Meanwhile, German intelligence noticed nothing. The Wehrmacht signals intelligence, the prisoner interrogations, the reconnaissance reports flowing back to OKW. None of it flagged the M26 as a factor requiring doctrinal adjustment. The reason was simple. 20 tanks don't generate intelligence signatures. They don't mass for offensives or appear in aerial photographs by the hundreds. They slide into the order of battle like a needle into a haystack, invisible until they're not. German doctrine on American armor remained frozen in the summer of 1944. The Panther's superiority over the Sherman was established fact, confirmed by kill ratios that Wehrmacht analysts studied with satisfaction. Staff reports from this period, captured later and translated for the Foreign Military Studies series, continue to list American armor as a secondary threat, dangerous only in mass, manageable by properly positioned anti-tank defenses. The reports mention the Sherman by name. They mention the threat of American air power in exhaustive detail. They do not mention the M26 because they do not know the M26 exists. Bartelborth's crew in Cologne operated on these assumptions. They knew what American tanks looked like, what they could do, the engagement geometry that favored the Panther in every urban encounter. They had no reason to believe the mathematics had changed. 49 days separated the Pershing's arrival in Europe from the moment it rounded that corner in Cologne. 49 days of depot work, training improvisation, administrative assignment to the 3rd Armored Division's Spearhead Task Force. The timing could not have been closer. But the Pershing's gun didn't care about timing. It cared about penetration values. Penetration values are mathematics. Recognition is psychology. And in the fraction of a second that mattered in Cologne, psychology killed faster than physics. The Panther crew's mental model had been built from 18 months of consistent feedback. Every engagement reinforced the same lessons. The Sherman appears. The Sherman dies. Occasionally, the Sherman gets a shot off first, and the round sparks against the glacis plate or buries itself in the mantlet without penetrating. The Panther's return fire punches through the American tank like the armor isn't there. Smoke, flame. The hatches blow open, or they don't. The crew escapes, or they don't. The Panther survives. This pattern repeated across France, Belgium, Germany, through the bocage and the snow, through the rubble of shattered cities. The pattern was so consistent that it became invisible, the way gravity becomes invisible. You don't think about gravity. You just know which way things fall. Bartelborth's crew knew which way tank engagements fell. They had internalized a set of assumptions so thoroughly validated by experience that questioning them would have felt like questioning arithmetic. Assumption 1. The American tank will be a Sherman. Not because no other American tanks existed. The crew had certainly seen tank destroyers, half-tracks, armored cars, but because in tank versus tank engagements, the Sherman was what appeared. The silhouette was burned into the gunner's reflexes. The proportions, the turret shape, the way the hull rode on its suspension. Recognition happened below conscious thought, faster than language. The gunner's hands would already be moving before his mind finished processing what he saw. Assumption 2. The first aimed shot wins. In an ambush position like the one in Cologne, the defender has the advantage. The attacker rounds a corner into an unknown situation. The defender has already laid his gun on the corner, already estimated the range, already decided where to place the round. The attacker needs time to identify the threat, traverse to target, estimate range, aim. That time gap, measured in seconds, sometimes fractions of seconds, belongs to the defender. The Panther owned that gap. Assumption 3. Even if the American fires first, it doesn't matter. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any combat range. American tankers knew this. German tankers knew this. The only way a Sherman killed a Panther from the front was a lucky shot into the gun mantlet's shot trap, a small area where the geometry could deflect a round downward into the thin hull roof. That shot required precision aiming under fire, and it required getting close enough for the round to retain enough energy to penetrate. Most Sherman crews never got the chance. They were dead before they finished traversing. Assumption 4. Range favors the Panther. The KWK-42's muzzle velocity exceeded 1,000 meters per second. The flat trajectory made range estimation less critical. The penetration values stayed lethal, out to distances where the Sherman's gun became a noisemaker. In open country, Panthers engaged at 800 meters, 1,000 meters, ranges where the Sherman couldn't reply effectively. In urban terrain like Cologne, ranges collapsed to meters instead of kilometers. But that only amplified the Panther's advantage. At 80 meters, the Panther's gun would go through a Sherman's frontal armor, out the back, and into whatever was behind it. These four assumptions formed a combat geometry that had not failed in 18 months of fighting. The Panther dominated the Sherman because every variable favored the Panther: firepower and protection, the basic physics of armored engagement. American numerical superiority mattered in campaigns, not in single engagements. 5 Shermans could eventually kill a Panther by flanking it, surrounding it, getting side shots into the thinner hull armor. But one Sherman rounding one corner into one Panther's gun was not a fight. It was an execution. The crew in Cologne had executed that geometry dozens of times. The loader knew how fast he could slam another round into the breech after the first shot. The gunner knew how quickly he could reacquire if the first target burned and a second appeared. The commander knew how long they could hold the position before American infantry worked around the flanks with bazookas. Every man in that Panther understood his role in a tactical system that had been proven against American armor since the summer of 1944. What none of them understood, what they could not have understood, because the information didn't exist in their world, was that the geometry had changed. The tank rounding the corner carried a gun that penetrated 120 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The Panther's glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick. The mathematics that had kept them alive for 18 months had just inverted. The Pershing could kill them frontally. At 80 meters, the Pershing could kill them through any surface the gunner chose to hit. But recognition comes before mathematics, and the Panther crew was still processing a silhouette that didn't match anything in their experience, still trying to categorize a shape their training had never shown them. While the American gunner, who knew exactly what a Panther looked like, was already firing. The film grain shimmers with the flat gray of March light in a destroyed city. Sergeant Jim Bates of the 165th Signal Photo Company had positioned himself in a doorway on the western side of the cathedral square, his Bell and Howell IMO cranking at 24 frames per second. He was filming a burning Sherman, the one that had tried the crossing minutes before and paid for it. The smoke rose in a column that bent east with the wind. The crew had bailed out or died inside. The film doesn't clarify which. What it does show, in the upper right of the frame, is the Panther, stationary, gun laid on the approach route, waiting. Bates kept filming. He would survive the war, return to civilian life, work as a commercial photographer in Chicago until his death from lung cancer in 1971. The footage he shot that morning became one of the most analyzed pieces of combat film in armored warfare history. Back to Cologne. The Pershing enters the frame from the left at a walking pace, perhaps 4 miles per hour, no faster. The driver, Corporal Clarence Smoyer's regular driver, was actually in the bow gunner's seat that day. The positions had been swapped for reasons the records don't explain. The tank's gun is already traversed slightly right, anticipating the corner. This detail matters. The crew knew something was there. The burning Sherman told them a Panther held the square. What they didn't know was the exact position: building, rubble pile, side street, direct line of sight from the cathedral steps. The urban terrain offered dozens of possible ambush points. The Pershing had to round the corner into that uncertainty. The film shows the geometry in brutal clarity. The Panther sat at roughly 2 o'clock from the Pershing's approach vector, perhaps 70 meters distant. The German crew had an unobstructed line of fire to the corner. They could see the nose of the American tank the instant it appeared. The Pershing's crew could see nothing until they committed to the turn. Classic defender's advantage. The crew inside the Panther should have owned those seconds. Frame by frame, the duel unfolds in less than 4 seconds of footage. The Pershing's nose clears the building line. The turret is already oriented toward the threat sector, not perfectly aimed, but close. The gun fires. Smoke obscures the frame. When it clears, the Panther is burning. "We hit him in the right side of the gun mantlet," Clarence Smoyer, the gunner, describing the shot in interviews decades later. The round entered the mantlet, penetrated into the fighting compartment, and detonated. The Panther's ammunition didn't cook off. German tank ammunition was less prone to catastrophic fires than American rounds, but the crew was dead or dying before they could reply. The film shows no return fire. The Panther's gun never moved. What the film cannot show is the interior of the German tank during those 4 seconds, but the geometry tells us what happened. The Panther crew saw the American tank appear. The silhouette was wrong, heavier, lower, different proportions than anything in their recognition library. The gunner needed to identify before he fired. Was this a tank? A tank destroyer? Something new? The mental model that had kept them alive demanded categorization before action. A Sherman would have given them time to complete that process. The Sherman's gun couldn't hurt them. They could identify at leisure, aim carefully, kill efficiently. The Pershing gave them no such luxury. The American gunner, Smoyer, didn't need to categorize. He knew exactly what a Panther looked like. He had trained against recognition silhouettes of German armor. He had seen Panthers in combat for months. The shape in his gun sight matched his mental model perfectly. Target identification took a fraction of a second. He was firing while the German gunner was still processing. The disparity wasn't reaction time. Both crews were trained, experienced, operating under combat stress. The disparity was recognition load. The German crew faced a novel stimulus that demanded conscious evaluation. The American crew faced a familiar target that triggered automatic response. In the time it took Bartelborth's gunner to think, consciously think, about what he was seeing, Smoyer had already pressed the firing pedal. The 90mm round crossed 70 meters in something under a tenth of a second. The Panther's mantlet, designed to deflect Sherman rounds, offered no meaningful resistance. The armor that had made the crew invincible against American tanks for 18 months failed against a weapon they didn't know existed. The film shows the smoke, the stillness, the burning Sherman in the background, and the burning Panther in the middle distance. 2 tanks destroyed in the same square, minutes apart, by the same Panther that had just died. The mathematics had changed, and the camera caught the moment the bill came due. What does a 90mm round do to a tank in the fraction of a second between impact and death? The question has an answer, and the answer is physics. The M82 armor-piercing capped round that Smoyer fired weighed 24 pounds and left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. At 70 meters, the approximate range to the Panther, the round was still accelerating through the last of its muzzle blast when it struck the gun mantlet. The armor-piercing cap, a soft metal nose designed to grip hardened steel rather than shatter against it, deformed on contact, transferring energy into the plate. Behind the cap, the penetrating body, hardened steel machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, punched through the mantlet's curved surface at an angle that should have favored deflection. The angle didn't matter. The kinetic energy exceeded the armor's resistance by a margin that turned geometry into irrelevance. The round entered the fighting compartment, carrying fragments of the mantlet with it. The interior of a Panther measured roughly 6 feet wide and 11 feet long. 5 men occupied that space: commander in the turret, gunner to his left, loader to his right, driver and radio operator in the hull below. The round's trajectory after penetration cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Interior ricochets follow chaos mathematics, bouncing off ammunition racks and engine components and the steel walls themselves until the energy dissipates. What can be stated is the effect. The penetration released a pressure wave that filled the compartment faster than human nerves could register pain. The spalling, fragments of interior armor blown inward by the impact, turned the fighting compartment into a shotgun barrel pointed at everyone inside. The crew died in the same 1/10 of a second. They did not have time to feel fear. Fear requires time. The recognition of threat, the cascade of hormones that evolution designed to help humans survive danger. The round traveled faster than the nervous system could process the sound of its arrival. Bartleborth and his crew were dead before the noise reached their ears. The Panther's armor had been designed against the Sherman's 75mm gun. That gun fired a 14-pound round at 2,030 feet per second. Respectable velocity, inadequate penetration. German engineers had calculated the protection values, tested the plates, certified the design against the threat they expected to face. The M26's 90mm gun delivered 60% more muzzle energy. A Sherman hitting the same spot on the same mantlet at the same range would have gouged the armor, maybe cracked it, almost certainly failed to penetrate. The crew would have felt the impact as a hammer blow, heard the screech of metal on metal, smelled the ozone of superheated air. And then they would have killed the Sherman with their return shot. They had trained for that engagement, expected it based on 18 months of experience. It didn't happen because Detroit had finally solved the problem it had ignored for 2 years. The loader in the Panther, his name does not appear in the records, only Bartleborth's, had been reaching for another round when the penetration occurred. The motion was reflex, trained into muscle memory by hundreds of repetitions. Load, fire, load again. The fastest Panther loaders could sustain 6 rounds per minute in combat conditions. He would have had his hand on the next round, would have been pivoting to slam it into the breech, would have been completing a motion he had completed 1,000 times before. The round never reached the breech. The loader died with his hand extended toward ammunition he would never touch, killed by a weapon system he had never been briefed to expect. Smoyer fired twice more. The second round struck the Panther's lower hull, below the turret ring, punching through thinner armor into the engine compartment. The third round hit somewhere in the superstructure. The exact impact point varies by account. 3 rounds in 12 seconds. The rate of fire reflected both the loader's speed and the gunner's confidence. Smoyer didn't wait to confirm kills or pause to assess damage. He gave the Panther no chance to recover. He was executing a threat with professional thoroughness, the same way Panther crews had executed Shermans for 18 months. The difference was that Smoyer's target was already dead after the first round. The second and third shots were insurance, doctrine, the trained response of a gunner who understood that you keep firing until the threat stops moving. The Panther had stopped moving before the second round was loaded, but the Pershing's crew couldn't know that. From inside their tank, through the gun sight's narrow field of view, they saw a Panther that might still fire back. They kept shooting until they were certain. 12 seconds, 3 rounds, one Panther that would never kill another Sherman. 10:47 a.m. The smoke still rises from both tanks. The cathedral square holds the silence that follows violence. No small arms, no engines, just the crackle of burning fuel and the distant thump of artillery somewhere east. American infantry move into the square in pairs, covering doorways, checking windows. The Panther sits where it died, hatches closed, a thin trail of gray smoke leaking from the turret ring. The Sherman that died first, the one that had tried the crossing before the Pershing arrived, still burns hotter. Its crew had bailed out. 3 of them. The driver and bow gunner did not emerge. Infantry reach the tank and cannot approach closer than 15 feet. The heat pushes them back like a physical wall. The smell was the thing you couldn't get away from. A rifleman from the 104th Infantry Division, quoted in a unit history compiled after the war. The smell of a burning tank is not one smell, but several layered on top of each other. Rubber, diesel, lubricant, paint, and underneath all of it, something sweeter that soldiers learned not to name. Inside the Pershing, Smoyer's crew sat in their positions, waiting for the infantry to clear the surrounding buildings. The loader had 3 rounds ready in the ammunition rack. The driver kept the engine at idle. They could not see the Panther from their current angle. The building they had used for cover now blocked the line of sight. They could see the smoke. The German survivor emerged at 11:02 a.m. Not from the Panther. That crew died complete, but from a building 3 blocks north. A Feldwebel with a minor shrapnel wound to his left forearm, captured by infantrymen clearing a basement. He had been part of a support element, not the tank crew, but he had watched the engagement from a second-floor window. His interrogation report, filed that evening with the 3rd Armored Division's intelligence section, runs to 4 pages of single-space typescript. The Feldwebel had not seen an M26 before. He described it as a new heavy tank, larger than the Sherman, with a longer gun. He estimated the caliber at possibly 105 millimeters. Incorrect, but understandable given the muzzle blast and the effect on the Panther. He reported that the crew of the Panther did not fire. When asked why, he said he did not know. The report notes his apparent confusion. He had watched Panther crews kill Shermans for months. He had never seen a Panther die to a frontal hit from an American tank. The intelligence officer who conducted the interrogation, a first lieutenant whose name appears only as Lieutenant Morrison in the file, added a handwritten note at the bottom of the 4th page. Subject appeared genuinely shocked by outcome of engagement. Repeated several times that the Panther should have won. Should have won. The phrase captures something the film could not record. The German military's entire understanding of the armor war in the West rested on the assumption that their tanks categorically outclassed American tanks. The Panther's gun killed Shermans. The Sherman's gun did not kill Panthers. This was not doctrine or theory. It was observed reality, confirmed in hundreds of engagements from Normandy to the Rhine. The Feldwebel had watched that reality invert in 4 seconds. He did not have a framework for processing what he saw. The bodies came out of the Sherman at 1:15 p.m. Recovery teams waited for the hull to cool enough to approach. The driver, Private Julian Patrick, 19 years old, from Lehighton, Pennsylvania, had died in his seat. The bow gunner, whose name does not appear in the records I have found, died beside him. Neither had escaped the fighting compartment. The hatches above them had jammed, or they had been too badly wounded to move, or the fire had moved faster than they could. The recovery team removed what remained. Smoyer would later describe watching the bodies come out. He did not elaborate on what he saw. The transcript of his oral history interview, recorded in 2003, notes a pause of 11 seconds after the question was asked. He said, "We knew those guys." The Pershing sat in the square for another 40 minutes, covering the infantry advance. No other German armor appeared. By 2 p.m., the 3rd Armored Division's forward elements had pushed 3 blocks east of the cathedral. The Panther still burned, a low fire now, the fuel mostly consumed. Smoke rose from the turret ring in a thin vertical column. The film ends before any of this. Sergeant Bates stopped cranking his IMO after the Panther died. He had captured the duel, the proof that American armor could meet German armor on equal terms and win. What he did not capture, what no camera recorded, was the cost of arriving 2 years late to that equality. Julian Patrick died in a Sherman because the Pershing that could have saved him was still in committee meetings when he shipped overseas. The cold, in a C-47 cargo hold at 15,000 feet, goes through wool and leather and settles into the marrow. Clarence Smoyer flew home in June 1945, 3 months after Cologne, wedged between crates of equipment manifests and a staff sergeant from the Quartermaster Corps who slept the entire Atlantic crossing. The vibration of the twin Pratt and Whitney engines transmitted through the aluminum floor, up through the canvas seat, into Smoyer's spine. He had not slept well since March. The Pershing had fought 6 more engagements after Cologne, all victories, no losses to enemy fire. The tank that had arrived 2 years late performed exactly as advertised in the 8 weeks remaining before Germany surrendered. 8 weeks. The Reich collapsed so fast that most Panther crews never learned what had killed their comrades in the cathedral square. The Feldwebel's interrogation report went into a filing cabinet at 1st Army headquarters. The intelligence summary that should have propagated to German units, the warning that American armor had changed, never reached the men who needed it. They were already dead or captured, running east toward Soviet lines. The information died in transit. By the time American industry proved it could build a tank that matched German engineering pound for pound, there was no German army left to be impressed. We got good at killing them right when it stopped mattering. A tanker from the 3rd Armored Division, not Smoyer, a different crew, quoted in a unit history compiled in 1946. The arithmetic was brutal in retrospect. 20 Pershings reached Europe in February. 40 more arrived in March. By VE Day, the Army had deployed roughly 310 M26 tanks to the European theater. 310. The Sherman fleet numbered over 40,000. The weapon that could have saved Julian Patrick and hundreds of tankers like him arrived in quantities that amounted to a rounding error, distributed to a handful of units, deployed in the final weeks of a war already decided by logistics and air power and the Soviet steamroller grinding west. The Pershing proved a point that no longer needed proving. American factories could build anything. They had built landing craft and bombers and trucks and artillery and radar sets and penicillin and atomic bombs. They could have built heavy tanks in 1943 if anyone had decided the problem mattered. The decision came late. The tankers who died in Shermans between Normandy and the Rhine paid for that delay in burning gasoline and spalling armor and hatches that jammed when seconds counted. The Pershing was an apology delivered after the funeral. Smoyer went home to Pennsylvania. He took a job, raised a family, did not talk about Cologne for decades. The oral history interviews came later, the 1980s, the 2000s, when historians tracked down surviving tankers and asked them to remember what they had spent 50 years trying to forget. The Panther crew had no such interviews. Bartelborth's service record exists in fragments in German archives. His gunner's name appears nowhere I have found. The loader, the driver, the radio operator, administrative ghosts, their identities lost in the chaos of a collapsing state that stopped keeping records in the final months. They died in a steel box 70 meters from a cathedral that had survived 4 years of bombing, killed by a tank their intelligence services had failed to warn them about. The war was already lost. The irony is almost architectural. The Germans built the Panther to dominate the battlefield. The Americans built the Pershing to neutralize the Panther. Both succeeded. The timing was the joke. The Panther arrived in 1943 and spent 2 years killing Shermans. The Pershing arrived in 1945 and spent 2 months killing Panthers. The kill ratios balanced on a knife edge of calendar dates. A year earlier, the Cologne duel might have mattered. A month later, there would have been no war left to fight. Smoyer's crew caught the window, the narrow slice of time when the weapon existed. The enemy still fought, and the camera happened to be rolling. The film circulated after the war, shown in army training programs, studied by armor officers, analyzed frame by people who would never smell burning diesel or feel the concussion of a 90-millimeter gun firing 3 feet from their heads. Smoyer watched it once, decades later, at a veterans' reunion. He said it looked different than he remembered. Faster. The Panther in the film died quicker than the Panther in his memory. 4 seconds on film, a lifetime in his head. He flew home in June with the vibration of aircraft engines in his bones, and the war ended 2 months later, and the Pershing went into storage, and the next war started in Korea with the same supply problems, and the same doctrinal arguments, and the same tankers dying in vehicles that weren't quite good enough. Smoyer landed in New York, caught a train to Allentown, and called his mother from a payphone on Hamilton Street.